Hello and welcome to Conversations on Conversations, where we explore topics to help us have more powerful conversations with ourselves and others. I'm your host, Sarah Noll Wilson, and joining me today are two of my newest colleagues, friends that I have met at conferences, Yee and Maddy Gabor. And I'm so excited for this conversation on neurodivergence in the workplace. But first, let me tell you a little bit about Maddy and Lauren. Lauren and Maddy are co-founders of Betterment Works, a playful professional development company on a mission to strengthen businesses and teams by helping people feel, connect, and do better at work. Lauren is a process-driven problem solver who believes that curiosity, consistency, and connections are the greatest drivers of great things. She is also an extroverted Hufflepuff who loves puzzles, pizza, and fun questions. She studied design and psychology and has been managing people, projects, and clients since 2005. And she previously helped grow the largest Lego-inspired learning through play company in the United States. Maddy Gabor is an impact-obsessed lifelong learner with a passion for leadership, data, and play. As a neurodivergent executive, she is well-versed in the struggles of focus, productivity, time management, and leadership. And her facilitation and content are informed by that experience. Driven by a dedication to understanding and an unending belief in human betterment, Maddy envisions more empowering, engaging, and compassionate workplaces for all. Using play and analytics as the tools and her values as the compass, she pursues this vision relentlessly. Welcome to the show,
thank
Maddy
you.
and Lauren.
Hello.
Hi.
We made it happen.
Finally, we did it.
It's happening.
Finally, it's happening. Okay, so I'm going to start with you, Maddy, and then Lauren, you're teed up, okay? So just so you know. So what else should we, as our listeners, know about you?
I would say like the most important facet of my personality that comes out in both work and life is that I'm just not a casual person. I am not casual in any way.
You're not casual. What do you mean by you're not casual? Because I experience you as very casual. But your language. So just define it for me.
Yeah. I don't dress casually, feel casually, think casually about anything. I have extremely strong opinions about things I frankly have no right having even any opinion about. I feel my feelings very strongly. I care arguably too much. I have, a lot of thoughts in my head at all times that I'm navigating, and I've never like casually engaged with a subject in my life. So for me, the distance between like learning something exists and having to know every single thing about that is like, it's a millisecond. And so I think that I bring a lot of intensity to friendships, working relationships, my job, all sorts of things like that. And one of the things that I love about working with Lauren and utilizing play as a modality is that it helps me take a step back from that intensity. And I find that my whole life is figuring out how to chill out a little, truthfully. And I'm really thankful to have Lauren as a business partner because she's really helpful for that.
I love it. This is why I like asking the question. I never know what people are going to say. And I feel like we learned so much about you, Maddy.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's hold on to that. Lauren, what should we know about you?
Me individually, since we're talking about that, I feel like my bio shares a lot about me, and it's very real. I feel like something that is useful to know, like a duality thing, is that I love people and talking to people, and I'm very like playful and curious. And also, on the other side, the other part of the bio, the process-driven problem solver, I am a very caring and kind robot. A little bit. I like, yeah, but like, what are we doing? What are you talking about? How does that work? And the small backstory to that is I'm not like, give me all the assessments, but I always like when there's like your personality or whatever, those ones are interesting because it gives you words to talk about something where you're like, oh, it's not shock, but you're like, oh, Yes, exactly that. And there's one that is the VIA personality characteristics, which has like 24 characteristics, and they rank them. And I did this with some people, and there's 24. So you're like, okay, that's a lot to manage. They don't tell you if it's like really far or really close. So we were like, well, what are your top 5 and your bottom 5? And my very number one thing, fairness. So real. And then like so the other like top like 4 or 5 were like kindness, judgment, prudence, honesty. And then the bottom 5 were like all the feelings, love, appreciation of beauty, spirituality. I'm like, oh my God, I'm a robot. So, but not really, but
caring,
a little.
But a happy, caring robot.
I'm a caring robot. I'm like Baymax from Big Hero 6.
Yeah.
I'm your care companion.
Yeah. You know, like Rosie from the Jetsons.
Oh, yeah.
What are the other,
No, that episode.
Bender from...
Well,
not really. No.
But you know that episode of Star Trek Next Generation where Data gets feings? I feel like she's kind of like that.
I got some Data 7 of 9 vibes.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. Lots of 7 of 9.
We're already off to a glorious start, my friends. Okay, So I first met you two, as I mentioned in the introduction, at a conference, and I didn't know anything about you or the work, but I was really interested in the session you were facilitating on essentially honoring neurodivergence in the workplace. And for those people who are listening, who are curious about this topic, who maybe experience it directly or somebody in their life, or you're wanting to figure out, these are two of the most capable people I've ever seen speak on this topic. The way that they were able to help people understand the challenges, the limiting beliefs, the ways we could show up differently, quite frankly, was a master class in how to explore accommodations. And so I was so excited to have them. And then since then, our paths have crossed. And so here we are. Okay, so Maddy and Lauren, just like give us the brief background of how you two came together and what does the work you do look like?
Yeah.
Because you're on opposite sides of a country.
We are.
On the country.
It's actually, that's so funny. So we have only ever been on opposite sides of the country.
Like not near each other.
Never close. We used to work at a different education company a long, long time ago. I think we met like a decade ago. And this weird pattern kept happening, which is that any time that we were trying to make something better or trying to address a problem or trying to fix something at this organization, we were always the two people that were like, yeah, let's try this. Let's do a thing. Let's try this weird thing that no one's ever done before. And through that, we ended up building a really solid working relationship at an organization where we had no reason to be working together, truthfully. Like we had completely different jobs. We covered completely different areas. We both managed full teams doing that work. But we kept sort of rising to the occasions and also creating occasions, because that's the kind of people we are. And the end result was when COVID struck and that company laid everybody off, ourselves included, we were processing that in the midst of a pandemic, which was challenging. Yeah. And the thought of not working with Lauren, really upset me. And, and it was really nice because at a certain point we were sort of like, wait, we can just keep working together. We actually didn't need all those other people. In fact, we were doing a lot of the interesting work for them anyway. So why don't we just keep doing it, but ourselves? And that's how we started our business.
Also, in regards to so that's how we kind of came together. And so it came from a background or a foundation of play and what that looks like, in many aspects of life. And then this particular topic of neurodivergence came up organically and accidentally on purpose, because Maddy's our resident neurodivergent friend. And I am...
She's waving. For people who are not watching, she's just hey. Lovingly waving. It's me. Hi. I'm it.
And I am less neurodivergent, highly neurotypical. I've got I've been told I have some spice and zest, but like, oh, we are so different and complementary in so many ways,
So
in
different.
good ways, but also
Yeah.
a lot of it came from just the experience in our other work and then this company of working together and figuring out how that does or doesn't work, or like what is going on. And they're like, wait, we're like really good at this now. And this is like so many things were things that I, as a neurotypical, like never considered or thought of until it came up in a situation or a conversation where like, oh, that's what's happening. Okay, now we know how to do this. And we're like, wait, this happens for a lot of people. Yeah. Let's turn it into a workshop.
It's I love it. And we've had some other conversations on the show talking maybe more explicitly about ADHD, or an episode that aired previously was actually my colleague Amy, who's very neurotypical and her husband is neurodivergent. And then obviously she supports me. And it can cause a lot of stress and it can cause a lot of frustrations on both sides. So since I have like two incredible experts, I want us to go a little bit back to basics, because I'm realizing that there's possibilities that people are listening, hearing us use terms like neurodivergent or neurotypical and wondering to themselves, what the hell are they talking about? Yeah. So I would love to hear, just from your perspective and your research, what are those names? What do they represent? And why is it important, knowing that our audience is largely people who are in leadership positions in HR, why it's so critical? So let's hold on to that question. I'll bring that up. But when we talk about neurodivergence versus neurotypical, what are we actually talking about? So whoever feels comfortable hopping in with that. Maddie, you're on it. You're on it. Let's do it, Maddie.
Neurodivergent person who has neurodivergence as a special interest, I would love to talk about this. So neurodivergence essentially means that it is a brain that differs from what is considered typical in neurological function. And that can mean a lot of different things. And I think it's really important to remember that, of course, it is a spectrum, but also there are not clear boundaries around a lot of these things. So very commonly, we think of things like autism, ADHD, dyslexia, but it also—
Tourette's.
It includes things like fetal alcohol syndrome, visual and auditory processing disorders, hyperlexia, which is, of course, the opposite.
What's that?
It's the opposite of dyslexia. So hyperlexia is people who have extremely advanced cognition when it comes to reading.
Got it. Okay.
If you are somebody who can read very fast, remember every single thing you read, and also have very high reading comprehension, even though you are reading quickly, that's hyperlexia. It also includes things like dysnumeria or dyscalculia, which is the numeric version of dyslexia, and dyspraxia, which has to do with spatial awareness, right? So if you're a person who bumps into things a lot or takes corners wrong, you may have dyspraxia. And the thing about these that I think is really important to remember is that while each one of them has individual diagnostic criteria, a lot of them are overlapping, right? So you may have a auditory processing disorder as a part of your ADHD, or hyperlexia as a part of your autism. Or you may just have those things by themselves. And so one of the biggest challenges here is getting the whole world comfortable with the idea that these are not binary statuses, right? So you're not like, I have this and only this. And because there is a lot of overlap, and because in the medical community, a lot of neurodivergence has been undiagnosed or misdiagnosed, specifically in women and people of color, sort of the process of like, what is a neurodivergent person versus what is a neurotypical person can be a little bit challenging and muddy. And now there are studies that are saying that as much as like 65 to 70% of people are neurodivergent in some way, which if only 30% are typical, I'm not sure that we can continue calling that typical, but that is the language we have. And so it does cover a lot of things. And one of the things that we have experienced a lot in doing this workshop is a huge number of adults who come up to us after these workshops going, oh,
Is that what's wrong with me?
I might have that thing that you were talking about, or like, I think maybe my husband does. Yeah. And so it's an interesting thing because sometimes people don't know that neurodivergence exists at all. And then when they learn about it, they're like, oh my God, this describes me exactly. And truthfully, I don't know a ton of people that are like very firmly neurotypical. Lauren is one of the only ones, I would say, that I know. That just might be my friend group. But my sense is that there actually aren't that many neurotypical people out there according to latest studies.
Also, just as a neurotypical for now person, I don't know, neurotypical person, like you're talking about how neurodivergence is a spectrum. You can have like a part of a thing, or there's a lot of overlapping things. Even with being neurotypical, I feel like there's also like a spectrum. Right? Like, we're not all the same person. We don't all have the same brain. Like my brain works a little bit differently or faster or slower in different ways than someone else's, regardless of any diagnostic anything. And so I think that sometimes what happens too, like for me, like I consider myself pretty neurotypical because the way that I think, like I'm creative and I can think non-linearly, but the way that I like function within society is like, this is what's been set up and I function very well in that. It's totally fine. It's not a problem for me. And yes, my brain might work in some different ways, but again, it's a spectrum and it's just how well you can get by with where sort of society has expected you to exist. That can help, just because sometimes I will see like the memes and reels and TikTok things of like ADHD brain. I was like, ooh, I feel that, but that doesn't 100% mean you're like, oh my God, I'm ADHD. And like, maybe not. And so I think it's hard because generally people want a lot of binary, yes, no, I am, I'm not, right, wrong. But it's so much is not like that, especially this.
Well, and Lauren, you're opening us up into where I want to go with this conversation, which is that largely the workplace has been designed for a certain type of thinker, a certain type of communicator, a certain type of person that is inherently exclusionary to those of us who may need different kinds of support. And so I'm curious to hear you speak to it. I mean, I know that I can share my thoughts, my experience, but you're our resident experts, that even as somebody who has ADHD, I've often struggled with it being, referred to as a disorder. I'm like, no, it's just my brain is literally just, it's shaped differently. It works differently. It functions differently. And it doesn't mean that I'm less than. It just means that how I'm expected to show up is different than how my brain wants to be able to show up. So I'm curious to hear from one or both of you. What are some of those common ways? I mean, we know in American culture, right? It's very much was created by and for white men from a standpoint of like that binary thinking, that black or white thinking, the leave emotions out of it. There's a high value on written word. There's a high value on extroversion, right? All of that. So what are some of those things we need to be aware of things that we accept as rules of what work needs to look like, but aren't really rules? Yeah.
Oh, you're speaking my language, Sarah. So I have ADHD and autism, and I oftentimes struggle with this feeling of sort of like, I'm not wrong. The world is built weird for me. And I think that's sort of what you're talking about here. And one of the things that I see the most, which I find really heartbreaking, has to do with our understanding of communication and socialization. I think that the goal, so humans are social beings. We don't want to be alone. We thrive better in community, generally. And the goal of communication is to build connection. But neurotypical communication has a lot of unspoken rules and confusing criteria for success that I find as a neurodivergent person, I sometimes struggle with. And I think workplaces are an even more heightened version of that, because there's layers of like this is what professional is. This is what appropriate is. And
this is what civil is. Ugh. This is what respect looks like.
Yeah. And then, of course, I'm always like, well, who defines what civil is? Is it perhaps the white male power holders that we've had this entire time? So, that's a real struggle. And I think that it shows up in work in a few different ways. One thing I hear a lot from specifically neurodivergent women and specifically autistic women is that when they make statements, like straightforward statements, it's heard as aggressive. Or when they ask questions, it's interpreted as judgment rather than a person trying to ask clarifying questions because they're trying to understand. And I think there's a few things at play there, right? There's like a straightforwardness that some neurodivergents have in the way they communicate. And then I also think there's a layer of how we expect women to soften themselves in the workplace so as to not like upset the culture. And I think that those two things sort of interact in a really challenging way. The other thing is that I think a lot of times, a lot of the neurodivergent people I know are similar to myself, which is that they are just very excited about everything, excited about all the subjects. And sometimes that excitement is frowned upon.
Yeah.
And we really judge adults for being excited, especially if they're excited about things that are different than what you're excited about or the acceptable excitement topics. And so
sorry, I'm having such a strong reaction to the simplicity of how you just said that we judge adults for excitement.
Yeah.
It's so true.
It's really true. And it's so sad.
Yeah.
Actually, it's really heartbreaking. And especially when you're looking at neurodivergent communication, when somebody is bringing such, excitement into an interaction and they're just desperately trying to make a connection and it's met with like the least generous reception of that. And then, it goes back to the thing I was talking about at the beginning, which is that like the point of communication is to build connections.
Yeah.
Right. And so when someone's trying to build a connection with you, even if it's not exactly how you would do it, there should be respect and value in that, right? And feeling that value of like, this person is trying to connect with me. And like, I don't know anything about this subject that they are very excited about, but I recognize the absolute value of their effort. And I'm not going to shame them or judge them for being excited about things just because they're different than the things that make me feel excited.
That was one of the things that I remember writing down in your session and underlining is that idea of particularly somebody from a neurodivergent perspective, oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes can get really excited, hyper-focused. And the two of you described it as they're making this generous assumption that you want to hear about this because they're so excited about it. And I want to reiterate and echo the phrase you just said, because it was so powerful for me during your session and how often do we meet that generous assumption with the least generous response? And the connection that's coming up for me and now that was different is that idea of building connections, right? If you go to the work of the Gottman Institute and how people make bids, right? We make a bid for connection. We make a bid, and how often do we turn towards those versus like, oh God, if he goes on and on about his, for my dad, it's rocks. He just loves rocks so much. And it's like, oh my God, if, like sometimes it's met with like,
we get it. Okay.
We get it. You're like, but it's like, but I love that invitation of everyone's coming from a place of wanting to connect. We had, I want to share this and I'm curious to get both of your responses to it. So we had this really incredible woman on the show, Vanessa McNeil. And one of the things we were talking about is how we always are coming from a place of love or fear. And she actually further defined it as we're either coming from a place for love or from love. Like we're looking for that connection or we want to show that love. Like there was something really beautiful about that. And that was just a connection I was making as you were talking, Maddy. Yeah. Lauren, what comes up for you?
I feel like there's like, Maddy gave some very good specific examples, and I'm going to generalize a little bit just because it is hard because we don't know your workplace or like what your experience is. And like, we don't have all the answers. We're toolbox educators. We're like, we don't have the answer. We have stuff that you can use when you see fit, and we want to give you those tools and skills and ideas and practices. So I'm going to generalize a little bit based off of like our past work, where we used to work with kids and learning through play. Now we do like adults and learning through play. But in that same idea, and like what assumptions are in the workplace and the structures that are in place and all of that stuff is one of my individual perspectives on like the world loosely, is just like, I feel like everybody could have better benefit from adulting like a kid, is like what I call it, because when we're kids, or when you're talking to kids or working with kids or interacting with kids, like there's so much more grace, right? Like they're coming at you with like, did you know that in Minecraft there's these mobs and there's tarantulas and you can do this with a sheep, and if you chop down a tree, and you're like, oh my God, what is happening? But you're like, yeah, tell me about Minecraft. But if an adult comes at you talking about rocks, you're like, why are you talking to me? Similarly, like if a kid is just like losing it because they've been sitting in circle time, like in elementary school for like 20 minutes, and they're just like starting to like bounce around, you're like, do you need to go walk around over there? But with adults, we like, that's no longer allowed. We like
you should be able to continue. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
We get trained out of it. Like, you aren't supposed to move around. You're supposed to have eyes on me and like sit still and like know the right answers. And we get trained into that, and that's just the expectation. But like, we're still the same humans, and like, adults need to move around. Adults also want to talk about stuff. Adults also have like a weird idea that maybe is like, they just had an idea and said a thing, and maybe it is in like a brainstorm or something, but it feels too weird or out of reach, or like, we don't have the budget. You're like, yeah, but maybe it might get somewhere if you let it get somewhere. And there's just so many generalized versions of what we allow for kids that we don't allow for adults in so many ways. Excitement, or like, if you're thinking like schoolwork and work, like the ways that people are allowed to interact with material or each other, it gets really tamped down and like rigid and like tightened up for adults. And there's just like, why? Like, can we loosen up a little bit? Like, why do we need, like, why do we require this? Is it really hurting anybody? Like, it's very general, but it's a parallel.
I think that's such a good, Maddy. I want to hear from you. I just want to share this reflection that, why do we require this? And for us, the language we like to use is this a rule, or is this a possibility? Is this just one way we can do something, or are there other ways to do it? And what we see is sometimes you're so trained into it that you lose perspective of what else could even be possible, because there's been this very clear right or wrong, or here's how you get promoted, or here's who gets promoted. Maddy, what's coming up for you?
Oh, like 9 million thoughts casually.
I know. So like start at 67, 513.
Sort of jumping off of what Lauren was saying about sort of how we accept things from children that we don't accept from adults. And we think that that's part of being like a grown-up. She talked about excitement, which I think is a really good example of that. One of the other ones is being bad at things, right? Like, we allow kids to be in the process of learning. And we do not really comfortably allow that for adults. No. And
you're supposed to know everything and know better.
And it's so unfortunate, because basically none of us know anything. Like, on a basic level, we are just all sort of lying to ourselves and being like, no, I know everything. It's fine. I think what happens is, as we get older, we start to associate a lot of the desire for certainty is the same thing as security. And so we make these very rigid boxes at work for people to, this is your job. This is how we expect you to deliver. This is what right is. This is the right way to solve this problem. And we do all of that because our brains, while being really complicated, are also very simple. And predictability and certainty feels like security to us. And so we sacrifice the messiness of curiosity and risk-taking and the unknown and imperfection in favor of a false sense of security that comes with having very rigid boundaries. And part of the reason that we are, as adults, not great at problem solving is because we do that, right?
Yeah.
You're at work and we're trying to solve the same problem we have all the time in the same 4 ways we try to solve it.
Yeah.
Because nobody feels safe enough to be risky in the way that they try to solve it. And then we wonder why we have the same persistent problems all the time. And, you know, some of it is because you always have the same types of people in the room making the choices. But another part of it is that we've like erected all of these rules about how things are supposed to be. And it kills our divergent thinking. It kills our creativity. And ultimately, we just sort of stay in whatever the swamp of the problem is. And truthfully, if we were more comfortable behaving like children, I think we would have an easier time solving some of these problems.
That point of certainty feels like security is so powerful, so valuable. I mean, we know that so much of the root cause of anxiety, we were privileged to have 2 like world leading psychologists on the show last year. And it's the root cause of anxiety. So it makes sense that people are seeking the sense of certainty, but it's limiting.
So
it limits how you can show up. It limits how you think about. It limits how you solve problems. It limits, what you create. And not to say, and I think sometimes this is what we hear from clients, and I'm sure you do too, of like, but we are still a business that needs to run and make money. Like, we're not saying blow it all up. Right? Like when we say experimenting or being curious, it's not, hey, let's just throw everything out and rebuild it. But where are the opportunities where we could take some, what is Dr. Amy Edmondson? She said on our show,
love her.
She's amazing.
It was
like, whoa, she's incredible. Did you know we were able to have? Yeah. But it was like, basically her point is, what? Sort of what's the safest risk we can take that's going to give us the most information.
Absolutely.
But let's take that risk. Yeah, Lauren, I can see you have some thoughts.
Well, there's, in response to that, and then I do have a thought, but in response to that, I think that, again, the binary, and people go to like the, a lot of people go to like, what's the worst that could happen? And also just like, don't think about what's the best that could happen. Or like, what's the like tiny minuscule thing that might happen, because it's not gonna be the worst thing. It won't. Like, I mean, responsibly, like you could do it, but probably not. That's not what's gonna happen. And I think that people just also, as adults, get like really stuck in the like, but we don't want like the worst thing to happen. And we aren't practiced in experimenting, making a mistake, learning from it, trying again, because it's like too risky, or like it's going to cost so much money, or like whatever's going to happen, which is a risk, but like you can do it in an educated, thoughtful way, not in a like, we're just going to try whatever. Like, no, that's not.
Yeah, exactly.
That's not
we're not throwing spaghetti against the wall.
Yeah, no, we're going to
we
like
are making some
spaghetti.
like educated information and then trying things, but
But we're out of practice. So like any version of that feels scary. It's like when people aren't used to getting feedback feels like criticism. Like if you're not good at making mistakes, like every mistake is the worst possible thing. So we all should practice that more, maybe. But the other thing that I was going to say, that as it's interesting, because like as the neurotypical person here, you're talking about how the job world, security feels like certainty, and security feels good. And that's why we have like these boxes and expectations and this list and a process for things. And within that, there's still a lot of weird gray area of like company culture versus the like the outward what's said versus the like how it all actual happens. And for like the flip side, for what I've come to realize for neurodivergent folks, there's a lot of uncertainty in that mismatch, because certainty feels like security. And when you're like, well, I'm certain of this because that's the rule, but then like no one's doing the rule, you're like, I'm anxious now. And so like there's a equal and opposite thing happening with what that is creating or causing for different people. Because again, we're all different. And it's like, we do have to figure out some version of the collected agreement upon this is how we're going to function together, but it's been heavily weighted on one side. But we to meet more in the middle, like yes, this is better for you, but it's like way worse for somebody else, depending on what the situation at hand might be.
Yeah. Lauren, that's such a good call out of the implications when there's a disconnect between what a company or team or even a leader says, this is what we're going to do, and how we always show up. And we know that can lead to distrust, right? Because people aren't sure. But it is interesting to look at it that through the lens of neurodivergence and going, but you said this was the rule and I did this, but you all aren't doing this. And now I'm really, really struggling because you all aren't doing this as well. I mean, because that's part of it. For some people, and maybe Maddy, you can speak to this, for some people, the neurodivergence shows up as struggle, pain, like understanding those social cues, being able to read emotions, understanding what the kind of quote unquote appropriate, you know, and again, people listening, I'm doing really hard air quotes, right? That for some people I know in my life, my loved ones and friends and family, that there's this need of needing to be explicit because the implicit is really hard for them to register or to interpret. And I don't know if I'm speaking about that accurately. That's just been my observation.
Yeah, you definitely are. We talk a lot about implied versus explicit communication because a lot of times neurotypical people in positions of power feel they are being explicit. And the people on the receiving end do not feel that, especially if you're neurodivergent. And then when you add to that somebody asking clarifying questions, being interpreted as judgment or backtalk, it can really
or being
escalate.
difficult.
Yeah, it can really escalate in a way that is, I don't think, anybody's intention in that conversation. And I struggle with something that a lot of neurodivergent people have, which is a rigid sense of justice. And the justice is not necessarily around legality or morality. It's just, this was my understanding of what the rule was, but no one seems to be following that rule. So is it just this rule, or do all rules mean nothing here? And like, that is a really complicated thing to navigate when you're when you ask questions, it's interpreted poorly, right? Because you're just kind of stuck where you're like, I feel a lot of anxiety and cognitive dissonance because these two things don't align. But when I try to get like clarification around these things, it is interpreted as like subtle rebellion or like being difficult. And that's so challenging because I don't know what to do in that situation. And it sort of goes back to what Lauren was saying, which is like, certainty for who? Security for who? Right? Because for me, that makes me feel deeply insecure because most people want to do a good job at their job. Like, we encounter a lot of different work environments, and it is so rare that I encounter somebody that's just like, nah, I don't care. I don't want to do a good job. I don't care. Like, that's almost never the situation. It's usually some mixture of like a lack of clarity, a miscommunication, or something along those lines, or, you know, a perception about a person getting in the way of the reality. And it is such a struggle because I think that sometimes neurotypical people in positions of power see having to be very clear in their communication as a statement about somebody else's inability to act autonomously or be proactive. And like, that's not what that is, right? This is, again, hearkening back to sort of some of our work in schools. We're very generous about meeting kids where they're at in order to get them to the goal we're trying to achieve. And then when we become adults, all of a sudden we're just not willing to do that. And that's really unfortunate because it's self-defeating for everyone involved.
Yeah.
Right? Like if you just did this extra work to be clear and explicit about your communication, then it would work better for everyone. And even for neurotypical people, I think sometimes people are afraid that if they're extra clear, they're going to be interpreted as perhaps condescending to a person. I think that there needs to be generosity on both sides of a conversation. And so when people are extra clear with me, my feeling is like, thank you. That is so helpful. I really appreciate that.
I want to chime in on that too, because I feel like this conversation about clarity and communication has been a lot of from the questions, well, like misalignment, and then also from the question side. I also want to say kind of like what you just touched on, Maddy, the thing about when someone's very direct and clear. I will say, again, in experiencing this from the other side, if a person potentially neurodivergent or otherwise is being very clear, sometimes that is perceived as condescending, which is why, or like, ugh, so they're such a know-it-all or whatever, which is why we societally are like, I don't want to do that. So like, I'm trying to be less direct. And when people do it to me, that's how it feels. But in the same way of like the misalignment of information, I feel like sometimes when people are being very clear, if they're the neurodivergent side and you're experiencing it as a neurotypical and they're just like, actually, that's not what we're supposed to be doing. And you're like, whatever. But I feel like what's, again, the connection that's trying to happen is like, we're just trying to all get on the same page. And I wanted to make sure that you had the same information that I had, because it looked like you didn't have the same information because we're operating in a different way. But we get very stuck on our like, ugh, they're coming at me. Either with questions or aggressive facts.
Yeah. Well, and this is something that we see so much and are such big advocates in our work. And just was having this conversation yesterday with a group of, there is no such thing as a right way.
Yes.
There's no right words. Even when we talk about implicit versus explicit, some cultures are very implicit. And then what does that look like? And how do we navigate that? And then there are cultures who value that more, being explicit. And I'm like, it's just what's right for that relationship. But for those two people, how do we take the time? And I love the language you both have used so many times of how do we be generous with each other? How do we test those assumptions? And you didn't use that language, but the way you were describing is, well, how do we check that assumption that, oh, wow, you're being condescending? Like, no, I'm actually just trying to, and it's funny because this just came up yesterday because somebody said, I realized as a manager, I lose trust in somebody when they don't keep me updated along the way. And I just hear about it at the end. And then someone else said, I would feel like you were micromanaging me if you wanted updates more frequently. Beautiful. That friction point, you two need to talk about and essentially co-create for you and your working environment. So one of the things so obviously I can just talk to you two all day long, but I can't take all of your time today. And this might be something that we continue to explore and we have you back. So friends who are listening, if there are questions you have or challenges you're experiencing, feel free to reach out. Send it to us at podcast@sarahnollwilson.com. The one thing that I am curious about is, some of the things you've talked about are how do we give grace and generosity to more people? How do we embrace the learning process? How do we communicate in a way that feels good for all parties, understanding the dynamics that it might not feel great to you, but it feels great to someone else or vice versa? What else, and I know this is a big question that likely could be met with, it depends. But what else should people who are listening to this, who either maybe thinking as somebody who's neurotypical, managing a team, supporting a company, what are different ways we can accommodate and collaborate across differences in brain processing?
I mean, my first go-to is so general, but I love curiosity. I'm a curious person and it really helps just generally. But in situations like taking a deep breath before you respond to something and just like asking more questions, whatever the situation might be, where it's just like, why did you do this way? Not in a fault way, but in a like, I'm trying to understand how this happened because I would never do that. So what made you do that this way?
Help me understand.
Help me understand. How did you get here? Why are you bringing that up? What made you bring that up today? How is that relevant to this? Did you know this existed? Whether it's a resource or something, like if a situation has arisen and you're like, why did they not just call this person? Maybe they didn't know that person was someone they should call. Yeah. So just asking more to understand the fuller picture, because we paint a picture, right? Of like, this is what happened. I would never do that. Like, they're not you. So like, find out and ask more of the who, what, when, where, why questions, whatever it might be, because you have the opportunity to learn something about, again, process or a thought process or just process in the workplace that you can fix, that then like this won't happen again for them or anyone else in the future. And that is very general, but can be used in every situation.
I mean, like a lot of distress can be reduced by just pausing and going, what do I actually know? And what do I need to learn?
Like,
and how do I mean, even at the top of this is one of the things we're so particular about practicing is, okay, well, you said casual. I know what it means to me, but that was not at all how it meant to you. Like when you say that, I mean, even just those small things. Maddy, what would you add?
Yeah. I think as much as we can safely extend generous assumptions about each other, the better off we will all be. And really, to me, that sort of all falls under this umbrella of the humility that we should all have as students and teachers in this world. Because one of the only things we know about humans is that like we're imperfect, right? Like
we're like that's how Dr. Edmondson introduced herself. She said, "I am a fallible human," and I love that. Like we're all fallible,
and like this is where I think ego really gets in the way of our ability to connect with one another. Is that we somehow have this feeling that like, especially as adults, and again, not so much for children, but as adults, that like really being honest about the imperfect nature of all of us as individuals is somehow gonna like, I don't know, harm your ego, or you're going to get like points against you in the cosmic metric of people keeping score, which I think is really unhelpful to the whole world. One of the things that we really love about play is that it creates space for people to be outwardly, openly, proudly imperfect, right? We are all in progress. Hopefully we will be for our entire lives, right? And if we can be comfortable with that in ourselves and sort of name that and share that at the top, especially if you're a leader, right? If you are a team leader, the more you can ground yourself in the humility of our imperfection, the easier it is to extend generous assumptions to ourselves and to others. And I do think that a lot of times what's happening at work when we have conflict is that our brains, again, we have that sort of like, oop, I feel threatened for whatever reason. This conversation makes me feel like I'm straying from the social norm. I may have inadvertently caused harm. I might be doing something that I didn't know was immoral, right? Like there are all sorts of reasons that we can experience feelings of threat. And our natural response to that is sort of out of our control, right? The immediate response to those things is usually some sort of rush of feelings that's chemical. And then a lot of times it's our first response is how we've been trained through life and not necessarily how we actually feel or what we think would be the most productive thing to say or do moving forward. And so I think when you are having those experiences at work, like becoming practiced and being like, oh, I am having a strong feeling right now. Or, oh, this is not going how I wanted it to go. And then taking that moment to like take a deep breath and like ground ourselves in our imperfection as the starting point will make it so much easier to meet other people in their imperfection. And from there, you can move forward.
I love it. Ladies, I could talk to you all day.
Ditto.
But I can't, but I can't. I won't, because you need to get back to your day. Okay. So, I want to make sure people know how to connect with you. So for people who are interested in working with you, hiring you, for their company, coaching, all of the amazing work, what is the best way for people to connect with you too?
Well, for starters, you can just send us an email. My email is maddie@bettermentworks.com. Lauren's is lauren@bettermentworks.com, surprisingly. You can also check out bettermentworks.com. We do workshops, learning and development, training, coaching, all sorts of culture work for the workplace. And I know, today we're talking a lot about neurodivergence, but that's not the only thing we do.
No,
we do a lot of other things.
They do a lot of other things, and they do it in such an amazing way, both virtually and in person. And so if you're looking for a dynamic duo to help you become better, I highly recommend Maddie and Lauren. Maddie and Lauren, thank you so much for coming on the show. I appreciate you both.
We appreciate
Thank you for having us. It was fun.
It's so fun.
We'll do it again. Our guests this week have been Lauren Yee and Maddy Gabor. I don't know about you all, but there is a couple of things that they said that hit pretty hard. Gosh, that first one of just, we don't allow adults to be excited about stuff, made me question all the times maybe I've unintentionally silenced or shut down somebody's enthusiasm. On also this idea of we allow kids to be in the process of learning, but we don't allow adults to do the same. There's a lot of notes I took. And as always, my friends, we want to hear from you. What resonated? What came up for you? What questions do you have? You can reach out at podcast@sarahnollwilson.com, where I read and respond to all the emails that we get. Now, if you liked this episode and want to support the show, there's two ways. First, if you haven't already, please be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to the show on your preferred podcast platform. This allows us to increase exposure and to continue to have great conversations like the one we did today. And if you're interested in becoming a financial supporter, you can do so by going to Patreon and becoming a patron. Go to patreon.com/conversations on conversations, where your financial support will completely go to support the team that makes this show possible. So not only can you feel good about that, but you get early episodes that are ad-free, and you get unique swag that is only available to our Patreon supporters. So speaking of the team that makes this show possible, let's give them some love. To our producer, Nick Wilson, our sound editor, Drew Knoll, our transcriptionist, Becky Reinert, our marketing consultant, Jessica Burge, and the rest of the Snowco crew, thank you. And just a big final thank you to Lauren Yee and Maddy Gabor. I find their energy and their passion absolutely contagious, and there's something about the way they explain things that just makes sense. So, my friends, this wraps up another episode of Conversations on Conversations. Thank you so much for joining, for showing up for me, for showing up for them, for showing up for yourself. And remember, when we can change the conversations we have with ourselves and others, we can change the world. So till next time, please be sure to rest, rehydrate, and I'll see you again soon.